Good evening, everyone. I want to thank everyone for joining us here tonight in person. We really appreciate you coming out on this cold night, and virtually. I'm Rabbi Kaufman. I am Director of Content and Innovation here at Park Avenue Synagogue, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this program tonight on confronting homelessness in New York City. There is probably no greater obligation that each and every one of us has as a Jew than to protect the dignity, the kavod, of every single human being, all of us being made in the image of God. There's probably no greater obligation that each and every one of us has as a Jew to protect the vulnerable in our society. On Yom Kippur, during the Haftorah, we read from the prophet Isaiah the exhortation to bring the poor into our homes, which defines the obligation to mitigate homelessness as a Jewish religious duty, which is why this evening is such an important conversation. To start us off, I'm going to introduce Danielle Bessinger, one of our fabulous teens, who's going to share a little bit about her personal experience, and then she will introduce our speakers. Thank you for joining us, and come on up, Danielle.
Hi everyone, my name is Danielle Bessinger and I'm a 10th grade student at Eleanor Roosevelt High School. Last Saturday night, I participated in the Midnight Run. Previously, Park Avenue Synagogue had held a clothing drive where men's, women's, and children's clothing and shoes were collected, as well as socks, gloves, blankets, toiletries, and more. We sorted these items into categories and packed them into cars. We then went to numerous stops throughout the city, delivering these different items along with food and water to homeless people. The experience was rewarding and eye-opening. Saturday night was freezing cold. It was difficult for me to be outside for just a few minutes at a time, so I can't even begin to imagine the struggle that homeless people face during the winter. On our final stop of the evening, I met the most friendly man. He happily accepted each of the items we offered him and joked with all of us. He was funny and confident, and I genuinely enjoyed speaking with him. Although our conversation was brief, I could immediately tell that by nature he is kind and appreciative. It's hard for me to admit that there was a part of me that was surprised by this person's compassion and ability to immediately connect with me. As human beings, we all have implicit bias. We naturally judge and make assumptions about others, an instinct meant to keep ourselves safe. Interacting with this kind man challenged my assumptions and made me recognize that I likely make assumptions every day that are unfounded when I encounter homeless people on the street. I am interested in hearing what our speakers today have to say about the bias that we have. Today's presentation is Seeking Shelter, Confronting Homelessness in New York City. We are going to hear from Linda Gibbs and Muzzy Rosenblatt in order to explore the circumstances that leave people homeless and how our society got to this point, confront the tension between compassion and self-interest when we see homelessness on the street, and discuss where we go from here. Tonight's program is closely tied to PAS's commitment to Tikkun Olam and our ongoing work to repair the world through learning and doing. In addition to tonight's event, we have some upcoming opportunities to do good deeds together, which you are all invited to participate in. This Sunday, November 21st, is our annual Mitzvah Day. From wrapping gifts for children to assembling cold weather care packages for homebound seniors, there's a way for all to participate. Tomorrow, Wednesday, November 17th, from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m., we will pack and deliver groceries with Met Council at their Midtown location, 31st in Lexington. There are still a few spaces available. You can register online. You can also make sandwiches at home and drop them off at PAS on Friday, November 19th between 9 o'clock and 10:30 a.m. We will deliver them to the New York Common Pantry. You can sign up to make sandwiches on our website. Finally, this program is a part of our fall theme where we are exploring the many definitions of home. Our series will continue on Tuesday, December 14th, where we will discuss home as sanctuary and the rituals and practices that create a Jewish home with guests Whitney Robinson and Mark Karim Zeta. And now I am pleased to introduce our speakers for tonight. Linda Gibbs is Principal for Social Services at Bloomberg Associates and is a Senior Fellow at Results for America. She served in the New York City government as the Commissioner overseeing homelessness until 2005 and then as Deputy Mayor for Health and Human Services until 2013. Muzzy Rosenblatt is Chief Executive Officer and President of Bowery Residents Committee, BRC, a nonprofit organization committed to bringing stability and dignity to nearly 10,000 homeless and at-risk individuals each year in New York City. Thank you and welcome to our speakers.
Thank you.
Danielle, thank you so much, and thank you to you and all of your fellow teens in our Rabbi Judah Nadich High School program, and what you did on Saturday evening that presented a human face for tonight's dialogue. And so, from strength to strength, and thank you, Danielle. To Linda and to Mazi, we welcome you into our community. We thank the Tikkun Olam Committee. We thank Rabbi Kaufman and Mara and Lindsay and the entire programming department for making this evening happen. And of course, to our executive director, Valerie Russo, who oversees all of our efforts. Linda, I want to begin with you because Danielle just spoke of what she saw with her eyes in a one-on-one experience. But perhaps from your vantage point, and what an honor it is to have you here, help us contextualize this moment as far as New York City, homelessness. Is it the best of times? Is it the worst of times? Is this a moment that you've never seen this before, or is it just more of the same? Help us understand this moment.
Well, it's interesting, Danielle, that you talked about how cold you were on Saturday night, because tonight, as I was coming up, I saw that it is what we call code blue in the homeless services community. Anytime that the temperature drops to a certain level, there's a whole set of protocols, and there's like this silent machinery just kicking into gear that is going to extra efforts to make sure that the people who are on the street are safe. And so added outreach and ensuring that people have their wits about them, know what kind of circumstances they're putting themselves through to be willing to and choose to stay on the street in such cold weather when we live in, I think, the only city in the world that I have ever found, and I've done lots of traveling doing this kind of work across the continents, only city in the world that has a guaranteed right to shelter that provides immediate shelter bed if a person raises their hand and says, right now, I need a bed. And so despite that incredible offer, there are still 2,800 people who, by last year's street outreach count, 2,800 people who are sleeping on the streets of the city. Now that number is actually lower than it has been in the recent past. It's lower by about 1,000 from a year before that. And really interesting to see how the tragedy of the pandemic actually shook loose a lot of innovations and changed behaviors, including of people on the street who for years and years had resisted offers of assistance, had declined those shelter beds. But during COVID, because of the added health precautions, because of the added health outreach, and because the offer changed from a dormitory-style shelter to an individual hotel room, in fact, accepted shelter. So we saw a big decline in the number of people on the street. And then, very interestingly, New York City has because of that right to shelter, we have the highest in-shelter population of just about any place else. I don't know why I say just about, because I know of no one else that has the number of people living in shelter anywhere else in the world. And so the other really interesting thing is that the number of shelter homeless people went down during the pandemic as well. And that was primarily on the family side, perhaps contributed to by the moratorium on evictions, and perhaps by the family members, extended family members opening up their arms and letting people stay with them longer rather than sort of ending their stay where they're, because typically for families with children, they're living doubled up. They're living at home with mom, they're living maybe with a sister or a cousin, and that welcome can be worn out after an extended stay. So things, interestingly enough, in shelter and on the street are actually better than they were before the pandemic. And that's true across the country. And it's actually true in other cities and other places in the world. And to me, that gives insight a little bit into what is this challenge of homelessness and how do we solve it? Because Muzzy and I, working many, many years in this field, really do believe that it can be solved. But it takes a lot of people working in coordination from many different disciplines. The homeless services system cannot solve homelessness. They can provide shelter. They can maybe, by understanding some of the conditions that give rise to homelessness, can try to prevent it. But they can't provide all of the behavioral health services, the mental health services, the substance abuse services that are often a condition that leads to people's homelessness. You know, when people are being discharged from jails and prisons without a home, right? The homeless services system can't prevent that. So you need to have all of those other service systems working very closely in coordination. And I think that's what we saw during COVID, is that everybody stepped up. They got out of their usual patterns of behavior and they adjusted because they knew that there was this new and kind of a threat that was not completely understood. So people are going to extraordinary means to try to prevent and solve. And a little bit of the problem now is, all right, we're now kind of retreating back to business as usual. And that's where we're really, tried to, and we have this lovely book here with us. Muzzy and I and two other colleagues actually wrote the lessons that we saw from cities around the world, where we see these windows into solutions, but it really does require that kind of coordinated effort, an intense management with concrete data that everybody is working off the same page, and you just cannot relent. You can't step back. It's like a moving target. You always have to be looking for the next issue that's going to emerge and the next challenge and get the right partners to the table to address it.
Thank you, thank you. Muzzy, I want to turn to you because Linda's comment goes directly to my question to you, but there's only one way to call you up here. It's happened in the past. Can we get some audio, please? Amen, amen. So that was when you were called up on October 7th, 1978, yes, for Shabbat Shuvah, Parshat Vayelech, and you're back.
I'm back, yes.
And we thank Suzanne Eisenberg and
I stuck around for a little while after.
And the Shapiro Archives for making that formal introduction possible.
Wow, thank you.
And so it's been a few years.
Yeah.
And you have committed your life working, writing, on the front lines. And when Linda describes what Linda just described, I have to tell you, I'm struck by the intractability of it all. Mm-hmm. And I say, what can we actually do? And Linda started outlining some broad policy prescriptive measures, but you live this each and every day. And I'm wondering, what Danielle described, amazing. But I think a lot of us sort of stand frozen at the enormity and the intractability of the question of homelessness. So can you help us shape a conversation on this?
I will try. Thank you again. It is good to be back home. I never went very far, but PAS was very formative in my development. Peter Geffen, the high school, Rabbi Nadich, Cantor Lefkowitz, very fond memories, wonderful experiences to really do what Danielle did. And in fact, what we do every day, Danielle, there's a job waiting for you at BRC. And not just because your dad's an old Hebrew school friend of mine. Ricky, you did good. She's a good kid. But because what we don't see, we don't see a problem. Like most of us think there is this problem of homelessness, and I'm not here to suggest there isn't. There absolutely is. But when we do the work at BRC, We're a housing and social services and health provider. We have folks who go out on the streets and in the subways 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And then we have lots of different types of places for people to come to. We don't see the problem. We see the person. We see the person that Danielle met. And we see and try to restore for that person a sense of individualism, a sense of dignity, like Rabbi Kaufman referred to, a sense that they are valued, that there is a person there, not a problem. And then we also see them as, if you will, a customer, as somebody who we are there to serve. It's not what we want for them. Our goal at BRC, and I think none of our goals should be to rid the streets or rid society of homelessness, because that comes with it some negative perceptions or connotations or motivations, but rather to heal. How can we connect with that individual? What is it that they want? Not what do we want, but what do they want? And even though they're unsheltered, and they know that in most cases, they may not want a bed right away. They may not trust. They may have had traumatic experiences. Maybe they want a meal. Maybe they want a doctor. So we're trying to engage. Usually the first thing they want us to do when we meet them with our bright orange shirts and our best of intentions is to leave them alone. Who asked you to wake me up? Who asked you to help me? I'm fine. And when you take a step back and think about it, what it must take, as Danielle was describing, to survive, to cope, to navigate that experience is not pitiful. It's astounding. It's resiliency, and it's survival. And so the notion that people who have experienced so much trauma, not only once they became homeless, but think about the traumas that must have caused that homelessness to occur. The abandonment, the betrayed trust. Very hard to build that trust again. So usually when somebody asks us to leave them alone, after doing a safety assessment and making sure that they're at least going to make it through the night, then we come back and we keep coming back and we show our commitment is to them on their terms and build that trust time and time again. As any relationship is, you've got to earn trust, we earn trust, and then usually that leads to getting to know what that person wants, what their motivation is, what their needs are, and then using our skills and experience as professionals, how do we connect them to what's going to work for them? How do we bring them to a place that matches their desires and gets them the where to meet? For many, it is a shelter, and for some, it isn't. For some, it's treatment. For some, it's getting sober, and for some, a conditional placement, if I have to get sober to get a bed, is not going to work. And so being the navigators for them, being their allies, that is really the core of the work. And so it takes extraordinary patience, but it works. The tragedy socially that Linda was describing is that for all the lives we save, and we save thousands every year, thousands of people every year, just our organization, and there are many others, right? The things that most of us don't see are the people who come in, and definitely the acceleration that happened during COVID. We go on the subways and we see homelessness. We go through Grand Central, Penn Station, we see homelessness. But what you don't see are the 300 people living at the YMCA on East 47th Street. And I mean, you walk through there, you could hear a pin drop, who used to be living on the streets and the subways and now have a bed of their own. Or 130 in a hotel in Long Island City, or so many more. We brought thousands of additional beds online just during the pandemic, but the tragedies keep happening. There was a story in Harper's Magazine called "The Subways Are for Sleeping," and it was written in 1956, even before I was born. And so this speaks to larger systemic issues that aren't going to be solved overnight, but for the individual that Danielle saw, we get to know them, we heal them, and they come in and their life can be transformed.
But you said something interesting, and we'll turn this into a dialogue of that the goal may not be to get rid of homelessness altogether, which I just, from the cheap seats here, right, I think homelessness is something that we should hope everybody has a home.
Absolutely.
And so I'm just curious why that might not be a desired outcome.
It's an aspirationally desirable outcome.
And when you have looked at other cities and their approaches, what have you learned as sort of this aspirational goal?
I'll explain briefly what I was trying to say, and then I'll give you other cities. So I believe we can end homelessness. I agree with Linda. I don't believe we can do it without addressing some of the root causes of marginalization of people with mental health and substance use disorders, of criminalizing that kind of behavior as opposed to treating it, dealing with poverty, and the number of people who are barely avoiding homelessness, but are spending half of what they earn or more to keep a home and a roof over their heads, or racism and the systemic issues that lead to things like mass incarceration, that in a city that's 25% black, 60% of people experiencing homelessness are black. So there are those things that kind of set a stage that make it more likely, not guaranteed, but more likely for some people to become homeless. And so in the same way that I would love for there to be a day of no shelters, I'd love there to be a day of no hospitals, right? None of us want anyone to be sick. And a lot is being done to prevent illness, treat illness, yet we recognize that it's still going to happen to some degree. We want it to be rare. We want interventions to exist. We want them to be effective and with dignity and quality, but we're going to have hospitals and we're going to have shelters and we're going to make homelessness for those who experience it very brief.
Yeah, and it's interesting because if you look at the places around the world, there are some who have gotten the numbers so low that they are described as being at functionally zero. Not absolute zero, but functionally zero, which means that the numbers are rare, brief, and non-recurring. It should happen infrequently. When it happens, you should have interventions that can engage and help to overcome it as quick as possible. And now that you've seen that person's challenge, they should be supported in a way that it doesn't happen again. So rare, brief, and non-recurring. And there are some cities that are close to that. Now, Glasgow has recently gotten down to 2 people on the street. Now, they did have a major international event just occur on their city, so maybe that was a little bit of an instigation to see if they could get there. But there are places in the world that have very, very few people, such that they really are considered to be at functional zero. And it just shows, and so number one, nobody thinks that you could ever get permanently to absolute zero. Crises are going to happen. Issues flare up, meltdowns happen, and so there are going to be those moments that will produce somebody who is without a bed for a night. The important thing is that if you're in a jurisdiction that is focused on like that as a basic human right should not occur, then you're going to have systems in place. I sound like such a bureaucrat. You're going to have people are going to right. People are going to work across their bureaucratic silos, across their levels of expertise, and they're just going to figure out how to make things fit together so that you can put together whatever response is needed in that moment for that person, because every single person is unique. Their history, their background, their experience, the crisis they're experiencing. For women and for children, a lot of the cases are for teenagers, runaway from household abuse, for women, domestic violence. So there is no cookie cutter formula, but there are a lot of predictors and trends, and we know enough about those. We just have to be nimble enough that we can have the system in place, the resources in place to respond to that need when it comes up, so that you don't. And then it's a really interesting thing. People can get very, very acculturated to the street. We just did a really great program in Newark, New Jersey, right across the river, where there was actually a large encampment of people who had been living together in a community. These are people who supported each other, who counted on each other, who loved each other, and the outreach workers were trying to get them to, one by one, to come into shelter. And they're like, no, I want to stay here with, these are my friends, these are the people who take care of me every day. So Newark built a group facility. They actually used a really creative, repurposed shipping containers, did a beautiful redesign, and built anew. They called it Hope Community. And the entire encampment of individuals accepted shelter together. So it's really understanding what is it, in that case, the group had a need. It was, but again, it's like asking, what do you need? How can we help you? How can, and building the trust so that you can understand those life experiences that are actually causing people to choose that life on the street.
Right. Well, Danielle raised this question of the biases that we bring to this conversation. And, I'll admit to mine. I think homeless, I think an older male minority, some, substance abuse issue. But Linda, you're saying every story is different. Every story is unique. And you see the face. I mean, help me, before we get to policy prescriptions, I want to spend a few more minutes on sort of the faces, the human lives, as Rabbi Kaufman said, of every individual created in the infinite and equal dignity of God. What are the stories you see?
Well, there are a variety of faces, and I think the faces that we most often see that you describe are the faces of those living unsheltered, which is a significant, obviously, number of folks, though nothing compared to other cities because of the right to shelter. In New York City, about 10% of the folks who experience homeless or living unsheltered and 90% are sheltered. Go to the West Coast and you'll see the exact opposite. Which doesn't mean we have a victory here, not at all. There are the faces of families predominantly led by women with children that we don't see on the streets in New York, thank God, but who take up a big part, the majority of the shelter system, who are struggling from domestic violence and what have you. But the faces we see and the hesitations we have are people who are in extraordinary pain, who have been failed by other systems. I remember a young white woman who showed up at one of our programs from the streets, had been on the streets for years, had been kicked out by her foster family when she aged out, when they no longer could get a check for her or from her. And so she was of less value to them. Her teeth were broken, her glasses were broken. She was dirty from living outside, had not bathed in quite some time, and she was screaming at the top of her lungs, as we often hear sometimes people at night or whatever screaming. She's about 22 years old, and she had been out for a long time, and I don't think I have to detail the probable kinds of traumas that she had experienced. We had been told that, and we had been given, when we did our research, that she had had tons of medications and all these diagnoses. And what we do is we gently because we have doctors, we have nurses, psychiatrists, art therapists, musicians, social workers, is to go back to what we call her baseline, take her gradually off her medications to get to see the real person. Amy is her name. And what we were able to determine was that she was not mentally ill. Really, she was developmentally disabled, that she was basically an 8-year-old in a 22-year-old woman's body. And for those of us who have or have had 8-year-olds who get lost, get scared, or alone, they yell and scream a lot. And then if they get harmed by other people, they're even more scared of somebody who's trying to help them. And so that's what I think we mean when it's so important that, yes, there is data, there are statistics, and we can see patterns and know what systems people are coming from, and having data and accountability is critical. And there are patterns, and we should see them and recognize them and hold systems and institutions accountable. But at the same time, when we're then trying to heal that person, as I'm sure from your own personal experience, Rabbi, in trying to heal those whose faith and whose spirit may be broken, is to really get to the soul of that person and try to connect to the soul of that person and give that person comfort. So just like firefighters run into fires when everyone runs out, we run into people who are in great pain and try to give them calm and peace and comfort to get to know who they truly are. And Amy is doing great. She spent about 2 or 3 years with us. We fought valiantly to get her the rights and benefits that a person with developmental disabilities are entitled to, because the system said that if you get to the age of 18 and you've somehow managed to survive without being diagnosed as developmentally disabled, then you can't really be. So she now lives in a group setting for adults. She's learned how to navigate the subway. She's learned how to communicate her emotions and feelings in socially appropriate ways. And she's really a beautiful young woman.
Yeah, thank you. You know, I was reading, there was a piece in the Times the other day about 101,000 young people, students lack permanent housing. And I was just thinking to myself, I'm in a privileged position, and my kids hate it, and when it happens now, hate Zoom from home, right? Zoom school from home. But that all presupposes that you have your laptop or your iPad, working internet, and otherwise, none of which, for those, I'm not sure exactly what the working definition of lacking permanent housing is as opposed to homelessness, but the human dimension of what it means to be a young person without, it's not just shelter, but it's adequate shelter to be a participant in schools, education, and otherwise.
And stability, right?
Yeah.
The education system uses a definition of that essentially categorizes people that are living doubled up. If you are a child in a household and your parent is not a primary signatory on the lease, and you're living in under somebody else's roof, you're considered housing unstable, and in their definition, homeless. And so in New York City, what do we have? We have 500,000 people living in doubled up situations. So 100,000 might even be an undercount. In shelter, there are 25,000 children living in shelter. And so, the story behind those kids is it's just, you see the instability that is created and the difficulty in having any kind of normalcy, any kind of stable learning, because they're couch surfing. They're moving from location to location to location. When we were trying to figure out, the budget office in New York would never give us money for prevention. Oh, you can't prevent homelessness, it's unpredictable, you can't, it's like finding a needle in the haystack, you're never gonna be able to do it. And so we actually scraped together a few pennies of our own in the agency, and we started testing out with some of our nonprofit partners strategies on preventing homelessness. And we did a look back on a number of 30 families, and we just looked at what happened to these 30 families in the 5 to 7 years before they became homeless. On the strength side, everybody was really taken aback about the level of employment and education and being a primary leaseholder. So these are and overwhelmingly women coming in with their children, typically 2 kids, maybe 3. They had histories of employment and rent and leaseholding. But then some crisis interrupted that, the loss of a job, the need to care for a family member, that they had to give up a job, and then couldn't get back into the labor force. And then when the period right before they came homeless, jumping from house to house to house, and basically going maybe to sister, then to mom, maybe back to sister, then to cousin, and the kids over the course of a school year jumping from place to place to place. And that, a kid can't just think their way through a day, much less be calm enough to listen to a lesson and get to a school and moving from school to school. So there's just tremendous trauma that happens to children's developmental trajectory that becomes from housing stability, and there's so much more housing stability than there is homelessness. So that 100,000 number are those kids that are experiencing that level of housing instability. And that's where, for the single adult population, which is disproportionately male and which is disproportionately men of color, revealing all of the injustices and inequalities in the systems that produce that. On the family side, the issues are primarily economic, what I call economic homelessness. They either can't get a job, and nobody can get a job at, the entry-level positions that is enough to afford an apartment in New York City. Forget it, right? Our children are, in starting their careers, they can't afford an apartment by themselves. They're buddying and doubling and tripling up with others. And so if you're a young woman with a young family, starting a family, it's impossible to get a decent place to live. And that's where you see this, wildly disproportionate. You're spending 50, 60, 70% of your income on rent. Right? And so it just makes it like an incredibly fragile environment for children to be raised in. That is more pronounced in big cities like San Francisco, like New York, like London, like Paris. What is more ubiquitous on the single adult side is really the issue of people who have just been, quite frankly, abused by systems that they have been part of, that are supposed to be supporting them, that are supposed to be helping them. Amy grew up in foster care. The foster care system, I worked for years in foster care, Valerie and I. That system is there to help Amy and should never have discharged her in that condition. And so that really, the single adult population, overwhelmingly male and disproportionately people of color, are evidence of people that have underlying issues that have either been undiagnosed or diagnosed and not treated or mistreated.
Absolutely. No, but just on that, and so again, so what we see and we fear, I think fear is an understandable reaction when you see somebody whose behavior feels threatening, and it does feel threatening, or to go into a subway car and see somebody just lying down there and not know what to expect. But it is very much a system or a result of those failed systems. And that's what we do, is take the time to build those relationships. So, and sometimes it is dangerous, to be honest with you. We're trained to do it. I wouldn't suggest somebody go out there and just on their own try to do what we do. We're trained in how to engage people. We're trained in how to de-escalate people when they're agitated. But understanding why they are the way they are, that we may feel threatened, that's a totally normal reaction to feel, no judgment here, so do they. So it comes back, I think, Rabbi, to the point you made about home. When you have no place to be safe, when you have no place for support, when you're lying, trying to just get a few hours of sleep. How many of us have had to write those long days and nights, and you're like, oh, I just need a few hours of sleep. If I could only get a few hours of sleep. But you're doing it, you're trying to close your eyes on a subway car or a park bench, not knowing what might happen if you actually do fall asleep, that you need to, that the little money that you've scraped together panhandling, that the package of cigarettes that you're addicted to and may have, that somebody may try to rob you of that, And so the anger and the fear, some of that is a very strategic defense mechanism, that if I come across as threatening, I won't be threatened. But most people who we see out there are not dangerous. They're scared, and they're trying to survive, and we're trying to build that trust. And so just to take a step back and think about what does home mean and how much we depend on home. We depend on knowing that there's a place where we can go and close the door and feel safe, and what it must feel like not to have that. And when we wrote the book, we were each asked to kind of write a little digression, which I do very well, as you can see, about what brought us to this work. And I talk about my dad. So my dad was a refugee from Europe, was able to flee the Anschluss in Austria, in Vienna, he's Viennese, in 1938. Spent 2 years waiting for a visa in Portugal and arrived here in New York on the Upper West Side with my grandfather and my grandmother and a few things. And no sense of home, no sense of safety, some hope that somebody had welcomed them in and given them an opportunity to come here, like our outreach workers, but absolutely scared to death. And so I think on some subconscious level, that is still very much present in me and in this work, to just take a moment to recognize, not be foolish, not be naive, that folks without home, by and large, are more afraid of us and the world around them than we should be of them.
Thank you. So a very different emotional registry, my next question, but thank you for sharing what you just did, Muzzy. We have a new mayor, or will have a new mayor, Eric Adams. And I'm just wondering what's, on this particular question, what's in our new mayor's inbox? What are the policy decision points that await him on the first day of his job?
Yeah, and so it's interesting. The numbers are going down. They had been going down during COVID. My expectation is, without anything being done different from, as people are kind of retreating back to the old ways, is that those numbers are going to jump back up. So I think it's really incumbent on the mayor to figure out, to say, this is a priority. I expect all of my agencies to work together closely across a number of issues, but what could be more urgent than the homeless issue? And I want everybody to come together and to speak about how they are going to change their practices to prevent discharging people onto the streets, and what you're going to do in order to coordinate your services better so that you can solve the homelessness that does exist. And, I think that there's, mayor's tools can be somewhat limited. And so it's also, to make this kind of progress, the mayor's got to get the cooperation of largely the state government and even federal partners. The federal dollars that have been invested in housing in this country have stagnated and dropped in the face of growing income inequality and rising housing prices. And the federal government just has not kept up on providing those resources. And so, calling on the federal government to really fill its role to provide the support for affordable housing, but then working with the governor. The governor controls the behavioral health services, all the mental health and substance abuse. The governor controls the prisons and how people are planned for their return home. And, it used to be a time when people were leaving prison that were not allowed to be discharged from prison without a stable housing address to go to. And now, more often than not, what you see, the address for people getting out of prison is the 30th Street Men's Shelter. They literally give the address on 1st Avenue and 30th Street for the men's intake shelter as their home address. And that's an appropriate discharge plan, according to the state government. And so we've got to get the mayor has to do what he can with the resources that exist in the city, and they're tremendous. The people of the city of New York are extraordinarily generous in the support they give to homeless people. But it is a limited set of tools, and the mayor really has to figure out, not only how to get his own team to work together, but also to call on the governor and the federal government to step up more.
Can I just ask one follow-up question, and then Mazi, I'm sorry. You mentioned a variety of agencies, public, private, state, federal, local. Law enforcement. Where does law enforcement fit into this conversation?
New York has been a leader in supporting and training police officers to reach out to and to understand the complexity of the needs of people who are homeless. They've traditionally have had a homeless outreach unit, a very well-trained and engaged set of officers that have like a special team that have done this work. I'm a little bit dated with what the practice is now, but I guess my first take is in a lot of places across the country, it's defund the police and we don't want police anywhere near people who are homeless. But in every city, there are thousands of police officers and a couple dozen street outreach workers. And the public officials that the homeless are going to see the most are police officers. And so from my perspective, better to sensitize officers to what's going on with homelessness, what the needs of people who have found themselves homeless, and give them tools and resources and pathways. You don't have, because somebody has broken curfew and gone into a park that's closed for the evening, it doesn't mean that the only recourse is to arrest them or fine them. You can assist them, you can guide them to another place to go to, you can help them in a supportive way, and that's what police officers do by and large. And so there are some jurisdictions that really do criminalize homelessness, where it's like, anyone who's in a park, we're gonna arrest them, we're gonna lock them up, and then you're gonna make their life and you're gonna make the problem worse. You're gonna have them spend a night or two in jail. A lot of people who work on the street or who live on the street are working. They have jobs they go to during the day. You put them in jail, they're gonna lose their job, right? You're gonna make their life worse. But there are places that are really, they use the officers and they have criminalized the police. And in all honesty, New York has done that in the past as well. I think we've been a leader in reform on that regard.
Just on that point, absolutely. We actually are part of the training program for police officers, or we were. And there was a homeless outreach unit in the NYPD of officers who that's all they did, and they were trained in it. And we would do outreach together with them at times, and they were well-informed, well-educated, understood mental illness, understood substance use disorder, understood the resources were available, and pretty much understood how to be good outreach workers. And there's actually, I think it's page 50, where we write about it in the book and talk about the appropriate role for police. In terms of the systems and coordination, again, of course I'm going to agree with her a lot. We're co-authors. We don't always agree, but and I think one of the biggest challenges, to be frank, and this will be a little controversial, as I am with my peers, and every state is different. We have a very complicated mental health system here and very complicated mental health laws that give extraordinary rights, civil rights and individual rights and liberties, and those should only be taken away in the most extreme circumstances. But there are times and places, just like when somebody breaks the law, where somebody's illness is so great that they're a danger to themselves, yet alone possibly to others. And in most cases, people realize that and actually seek help, and often seek us out to help them. They will come to us and say, I need to go to the hospital. I've ran out of my meds. I know what's going to happen to me. Kendra's law, which is a law that requires people to participate in treatment or risk being hospitalized if they fail under a judge's order, came out of the tragedy of Andrew Goldstein, who was trying desperately to get himself hospitalized, couldn't get in, knew that what he had the potential to do if left untreated, and tragically, pushed a woman in front of the subways 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and it led to that reform. I think we need to see more reforms. We see people that we know very well. We see them dying before our eyes. We see them suffering. We know, and we've seen interventions that have helped. And so I think it's got to be easier for professionals, licensed professionals, who run the risk of losing their license if they abuse their license. And that's us, that's not the police. And not all of us, but those of us, not I, who are trained and licensed by the state, to be able to make a diagnosis and say that this person is a danger to themselves and needs to go to the hospital. And that is extremely difficult to do, and it shouldn't be that hard, because it is actually causing more tragedy, causing more death and suffering of the people we are actually trying to protect and help. And that's a state issue, but that the mayor should advocate for. But I do think there are things that the mayor can do. It's actually something Linda didn't mention, but something she did when she was in government, and I'm a recovering bureaucrat myself, left in the last century. But we spend too much money in government, I think generally, but specifically in this space, paying for the effort, but not paying for the impact. We hire lots of organizations, most nonprofit, many of goodwill and intention, a few bad actors, as there is in any sector, in any industry. Don't, paint us all with the same brush. We have the data. Who knows who are the excellent performers? We do, because of the work that Linda did, because she's so driven by her passion, but knowing that we have to have the data to know whether or not it works. And so we know who are the consistently effective, high-performing organizations that provide quality environments, that have few incidents, that are getting people housed quickly with very scarce rates of return to shelter, of becoming homeless again. We have all that data. We should ask those who aren't performing to demonstrate they can do better, and if they can't, we should take their contracts, their resources away, and give it to the organizations that know how to do it. And we will see better return on our investment, but more importantly, we will see better results for the people we are trying to help. Somebody in desperate need of help should feel that no matter where an outreach worker takes me, where the system sends me, I'm going to get high quality of care, that it's going to be a quality-driven system, and it is not. There is quality in it, but there's not enough of it, which is why even when people have a right to shelter, they're voting with their feet and saying, I'm not confident as a customer that that system is going to work for me, and I feel safer on the subway or in Penn Station, because I know the cops are going to protect me, and I don't know that they're going to protect me in the shelter. Now, that's not our shelters. And so what that means, and that's why I can understand why so many communities, when they hear a shelter's coming, think the worst. Because it's like, well, I don't have the experience, but the person living on the street is telling me the shelter isn't safe. They've got the lived experience. If they're saying it, why shouldn't I believe them? And that may be true in some instances. But so rather than saying, I don't want a shelter because, well, if not here, then where? It's got to be somewhere. Is to say, we're willing to do our part, but we just want to know there's going to be accountability. We want to know there's going to be dignity. We want to know there's going to be respect. We want to know that people are going to be able to feel safe inside so that we can feel safe as their neighbors. And that's what we do. And so I think that has not happened enough, and that has to happen if we're going to get to a place where we can all feel safe together, our clients, our neighbors, and our city.
So, best in class religious communities.
Oh, sorry. I thought you meant nonprofit providers.
Sorry. Of all of these various agencies, what's a gold standard for houses of worship to play a role in this conversation? Tell us what we should be doing here at Park Avenue Synagogue, or tell us what, we try to be the best at everything we do. If we're going to be the best at this, how can we model something?
So let me start, and then Mosey can
Happily.
add from there. I think there are so many things that volunteers can do. I actually love what happened in Paris, France, where we were helping them to conduct their first ever street count. In New York City, 20 years ago. I don't know, not 12 years ago?
No, more.
A while ago.
Yeah.
We actually started a process of following a very clear methodology of counting the number of people on the street, because we believe that unless you counted and unless you did that year after year, you wouldn't know whether or not the things you were doing were improving. And so we established this street count methodology that has since become the national standard. If you want to receive any federal dollars for support, you have to do this count. And so since, we've been helping other cities around the world. And so in Paris, France, the mayor wanted to do this, but she was convinced that nobody would come out and help do the street count. So she was going to make every single city employee mandatorily show up at midnight on a cold winter night to start and to work through the night to do the street count. And we convinced her to take a gamble that she would get volunteers. They had 2 times the number of volunteers that they needed. They had to turn people away at the door, and it actually inspired in Paris a whole new effort to engage the residents of the city around not just doing the count, but working on a number of levels to volunteer and support. So one is volunteerism, and I would say it's important to identify volunteer strategies that are part of the pathway of helping people to come off the street. Sometimes very well-intentioned volunteerism can actually perpetuate the amount of time people stay on the street. And so working with nonprofits that do this work and helping, Muzzy estimates that at least half of the people who sleep on the street have an active caseworker. So work with those organizations and think about how volunteer activities can reinforce the caseworkers' efforts that they are working on to help people off the street. Then the other thing, I would say there's nothing that underscores more significantly lives saved by all of this work than when you meet somebody who looks like just another New Yorker, right? And then they say, oh yeah, I lived 20 years on the street. And then you look and they have dignity, they have a house, they have a job, they have friends, they have a full life. And then you think, for 20 years, they were the person that, with all of the biases, we see this person on the street, and we're like, oh, that person has no future, right? There is nothing in front of that person. And then you realize the lives saved. We have tens of thousands of people that are living largely in supportive housing, who are living stable and fulfilled lives and are well-functioning members of the community and are making great contributions. And so this is a long-winded pitch to say, as communities, we should welcome facilities that provide support, like supportive housing. Supportive housing is, it's very hard to get it located in neighborhoods because people fear the worst. When in fact, the residents in supportive housing can be like the most stable, dare I say, boring communities. They just are so grateful for a bed and they just want to go home.
Thank you, Linda. I just want to make sure, just with the clock going, Muzzy, that we give you the final brief word.
I think, our religion calls on us to respond. It calls on us to make ourselves uncomfortable, as I think many religions do. And so how do we do that? That's what we have to do. And for each person, that's different. I think it starts with simple things that aren't that simple, and they aren't always simple for me, which is to listen, to find a time, to find a space, as we're doing here. So thank you for everybody who have come to listen. And hopefully we've given you something to think about. And to take that time, not to think we know the answers, but to take the time to listen and think about, to put ourselves in another person's shoes. I love Pesach. I love the notion of the prophet Elijah and opening the door. I'm not suggesting we just all bring a stranger into our house. That is naive if they're a true stranger. But so how do we practice that in a responsible way, in a practical way? How do we open our door to the life of somebody else and learn? And I think that is so critical. And then as we learn and we see that it isn't simple, it is nuanced, it is complex, to use the discernment that we use for so many other things that we choose in our life, our relationships, our vacations, where we go out to dinner, to expect and apply that same analytical and critical thinking that we use to say, how can we demand of ourselves something better than what we've got, that we're all part of the solution. And the individual actions matter, the individual choices we make. We can save the planet from getting warmer individually. We can help somebody who is vulnerable and fearful and alone, and connect with them, whether it's volunteering in the count, whether it's volunteering in a program, whether it's choosing this work, either early in your life, remember I made that job offer, or after you've retired from a good life to do something charitable. Join the board of an organization, get to know that organization, and get to know the people, as Linda said, that these programs benefit, and just push ourselves to be a little less comfortable so that we can help the person who is even less comfortable than we are.
You know, I couldn't help but think as I was anticipating this program, Rabbi Kaufman began our program with a beautiful image from the tradition. During these weeks, we're reading the story of the patriarch Jacob in the Torah, and each one, Vayetze, Vayishlach, Vayeshev, these are all Hebrew words denoting movement, to go out, to be sent out, to be on the move. And we know that this actually reflects Jacob's story, that he leaves his home for fear of his brother killing him. He sits down in his father-in-law's, which he has to flee due to arguably an abusive situation. Jacob, on several occasions, is lying literally with his head on the rocks, with no place to go. And even later in life, he's always on the move. He never has home. But in this week's Torah reading, there's one sort of sliver of hope, a beautiful passage that it says, Vayavo Yaakov Shalem, that he arrived Shalem, from the same Hebrew word shalom, meaning at peace, or more technically, whole. And it's my hope and my prayer that by way of this conversation, by way of our teen efforts, by way of seeing this not as the end of the program, but the beginning of the effort, that we can have that narrative of shlemut, of finding home, wholeness, and holiness, be the story of so many in need. Thank you, Muzzy. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you, everybody.
That was beautiful.